Audrey Coleman. I'm the Assistant Director of the Dole Institute and the Senior Archivist of the Dole Archives, and it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for attending today's program presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College of Fort Leavenworth. Before we begin our event, I'd like to tell you about a pair of upcoming programs that you may be interested in attending. On Tuesday, October 9th at 3 p.m., we will host a talk and book signing with Nathan Finney and Tyrell Mayfield, editors of the new book, Redefining the Modern Military. This talk will cover the importance of re-examining the profession of arms during and between conflicts and the impact of modern warfare and online communications on the military. A pair of programs coming up following that. One is on October 12th at 2 p.m. We'll be screening a free public screening of the documentary Big Sonia. The film shares the story of Sonia Warshawski, one of the last remaining Holocaust survivors in the Kansas City area. Following the screening on October 12th, we'll host a Q&A session with producer and filmmaker Leah Warshawski, Sonia's granddaughter. The following Friday, October 19th at 2 p.m., we are pleased and honored to be able to host Sonia Warshawski herself, accompanied by her daughter Regina Court, for a discussion about her experience, her firsthand experience as a prisoner in a series of concentration camps during World War II. We're hosting a group of high school students that afternoon as well, who we're glad to be able to share, help get them in touch and connect them with that story as well. Hope you will all join us that afternoon at 2 o'clock on October 19th. After today's presentation, we'll have some time for questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you're able and ask just one brief question. I'd also like to remind you to please turn off or silence your cell phones. And now, it's a pleasure. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Kalic and Dr. Gates Brown.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, this is kind of a Huntley-Brinkley type. So I'll handle a run-up to the revolution from about 1890 to 1905-ish, and then Gates will take over with all the exciting good stuff. The problem is we have, about 45 minutes to do it, so we've tried to rehearse it as best we can, so I'll try to cut mine short so we get to the good stuff, okay? So we'll start with really Alexander III, who is the father of Nicholas II, and you can see him laying in repose there as he dies, and we'll talk about that in a few seconds. But the reality is, what we're trying to do is sketch that the Russian Revolution that happened, or the Bolshevik Revolution that happens in October 1917, doesn't just spontaneously happen. That there's a long history of tradition of tension within the Russian system, I would argue, we argue, dating from about 1888 onward. So part of this is to demonstrate that it doesn't just spark off in October 1917, that there's a history of kind of tension within the system, and then Nicholas ultimately is going to abdicate in October, okay? So let's start with March 13th, 1881, right? Which is the first date you think about when you think of the Russian Revolution, correct? Especially in October, right? Well, what happens is Alexander III becomes the new Tsar because his father is assassinated by will of the people, which is essentially an anarchist regime or an anarchist party who's pushing for Russia to become into the modern age. So essentially, they've just gone out of serfdom, and a lot of the peasants want more power because most of Europe has now transitioned to kind of more modern age. Russia is still stuck in kind of an old monarch period, and will of the people is trying to push an advanced cause through revolutionary means, i.e. assassinating czars, right? And we'll see violence as part of the elements of the tension within the system is if you can't change it, well, you destroy something, and then you go from there. We'll talk Karl Marx, too, and all that fun stuff. So when Alexander III becomes Tsar, March 13, 1881, the first thing he does is he issues these temporary regulations. And these temporary regulations, if you know anything about the Soviet system, will sound very familiar, right? And it really is a means to preserve state security and suppress anybody that questions the regime, specifically the press, political parties, labor unions, anything that questions the regime is suspect, suppressed, arrested, or essentially thrown out of the country in exile. Sound familiar, right? Okay. And if you look at the second bullet there, right, part of it, it's not just about suppression, it's also building a police state that helps to arrest, imprison, and exile people that threaten public order. And public order, I would argue, is the important part of that. the person who makes the ultimate decision is the Tsar. So if the Tsar suspects you of threatening public order, guess what? See ya. And depending on how heightened he is or how threatened he is, you will either be arrested, imprisoned, shot, or exiled. So it kind of, if he's having a good day, it may be okay, you'll just be in exile. If he's having a bad day and you cross his path, maybe you're going to end up dead. But it's all, again, on the whim of who? The Tsar, which is another part of this ultimate problem here, right? Now, ultimately, Alexander thinks that these are going to be temporary, so you kind of suppress the will of the people, and you suppress this kind of new kind of bubble that's happening through harsh means, and he believes that really in about a year or two, maybe 3 maximum, you can get rid of these temporary laws because everybody will be happy. The problem is they really don't go away that quick, by the way. In fact, they'll maintain themselves up through Tsar Nicholas II. All right? So if you understand kind of the arc of Russian history, at the beginning of Alexander III's reign, it seems like he may be a bit draconian in the fine tradition of Russian tsars. But there's also kind of a happy side to Alexander III. So we're trying to do, happy and negative, right? We have to have some positive light on the situation. So what he tries to do is essentially make the system, make minor adjustments, give people kind of what they want to kind of pacify him so he doesn't have to have harsh repression. And the first thing he does is limit the workday for everybody, but also specifically children, 15 to 12 years old, which makes all the 12 to 15-year-olds really happy, right? He also focused on the textile reforms, which is one of Russia's major industries as the century is starting to kind of, as the 19th century is starting to wane. And it really is, again, focused on women and children. Now, these first 2 points are fantastic, but who's left out of them? Who tends to commit violent acts of, patriotic violence? Men, not 15-year-olds, not women. So you can see what's happening is the Tsar is trying to focus these changes to the system, but they're geared towards women and children mainly, and the harsh repression is left for the men, right? Again, we'll see how this evolves through time. The last part is, which this is really designed for the men in the system, is you're going to get regular pay, and you don't have to deal with excessive fines, because as Russia industrializes, are you familiar with oligarchs in the Russian system today, right? They date, I would argue, all the way back to this period as well, that if you own an industry and you're one of my workers and you don't show up for work today or you show up late, I can give you a fine of whatever I deem necessary, and the government will support it, which can also lead to arrest and a bunch of other issues. So to kind of give a handout to those radicals that may be out there, right? Alexander III is going to say, okay, you have to get regular pay and you can't dole out excessive fines. But again, who deems what excessive is? You start to see the theme here. Who has all the power? Who's making all the hard decisions on whether you're a threat to public security or safety, what an excessive fine is? Tends to be the Tsar and his ministers, right? So there's really no system that's allowing this social pressure to escape. The Tsar thinks he's doing, but ultimately he's not doing a whole lot. The second bullet up there is an undercurrent of social, political, and economic pressure, which is happening as the system expands. Now, what Alexander wants to do is he doesn't want quick radical change. In fact, I would make the argument that no Russian Tsar wants quick radical change. They're all about slow, stable change, which is what Gates is going to talk about. If they don't want quick radical change, there's a whole bunch of people in Russia that do, and they're going to get it come October. So what Alexander's trying to do to help mitigate this beyond his temporary regulations and then his positive adjustments, he's going to give more power to landed gentry and other elites, mainly industrial elites. So again, if you think about who's in power, it's the Tsar, his ministers, and anybody that owns large tracts of land or industry. And if you look in the middle one, the Zemstvos, anybody know what a Soviet is? No? It's a local regional government, okay? Zemstvo is kind of the original version of that. It's a local regional government organization that is designed to help alleviate social political tension in specific cities, villages, regions. And Alexander sees these as somewhat positive, but they're only positive if they're controlled by landed gentry or industrial elites. You don't want any radical peasants on these. So they really become a suppression tool when they're really designed to be a tool for political action. So the pressure that's building here is that the workers, the peasants, have really no real means for recourse because at every stage of the system, there's a gate that's going to suppress them. If you talk out against the regime, you could be deemed a threat to public order, exiled or imprisoned, or at worst case scenario, shot. If you bring up local grievances in your zemstevo and you're threatening threat to public order, guess what happens to you? Pick the issue, right? So the underlying currents that as Russia is industrializing, as workers want more rights, more freedoms, is being slowly suppressed and kept in check by the Tsar and these new systems. At the same time, well, actually, let's back up to, I guess, clarifying the period of Alexander III. In Russian history, he's known as the Peacemaker. He doesn't get Russia involved in a whole lot of wars. In fact, he gets them involved in no wars. And he's all about stability, but he's also about harsh repression. So he realizes there is tension in in the Russian system as Russia is industrializing coming into the 20th century. But the reality is he doesn't want change being forced from the bottom. He wants to control all the change himself. He's going to die November 1st, 1894, largely of kidney disease. So he's not assassinated like his father, nothing exciting. He just kind of passes away, and lo and behold, his son now becomes a czar. And by all accounts, his son's a pretty good guy. He's a decent guy. He's a traditionalist. He's conservative. But the problem is he's really not the guy to manage control. He really isn't empathetic to what's going on in Russia, and there's a supposition by some of the ministers that the guy doesn't like to make decisions. And the reality is Alexander III was all about making decisions. In fact, Harry Truman, buck stops here. Alexander would have been all about that, right? And that first bullet point, he's not an assertive, policy-minded leader. He's a great family man, and he's good about big strategic decisions and discussions in his ministry, but he's not about the day-to-day administering of the state. He's going to retain the temporary regulations, which is significant because any hope that, okay, we have a new czar, maybe a new time for change. The reality is meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And again, it's designed to sustain the political pressure, right? As Russia goes through its transition to the 20th century and gets involved in like the Russo-Japanese War, which is going to have a significant geopolitical impact on itself and also an economic impact on itself, the economic and social pressures within Russia are going to explode exponentially, and we'll get to those in a few seconds. The one positive attribute of Nicholas's early reign is that he's going to start to allow some small proliferation of political parties, which is significant, which they start out mainly as unions, like local, regional, village unions, and are going to explode into political parties, which at times are suppressed under the temporary regulation laws, but ultimately, as long as they're not doing anything that threatens the regime, they can kind of flourish and grow. And what I'll talk about is really three of them. The Union of Liberation, which turns into the Cadet Party, which becomes significant. We'll talk about the Social Democrats, which has two branches called the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. You may have heard of those characters, right? Then we'll talk about the SRs, or the Social Revolutionaries, which are probably the most radical. So if you look at kind of the screen down here, you go from kind of conservative, right? Conservative in the Russian tradition, by the way, to kind of radical left over here. And you can see that our good friend Lenin really is not quite far to the left because Chernov is a more crazy guy than he is. All right? So what's happening as Russia's coming out of really up into 1905, so kind of turn of the century up till the Troubles and the First Revolution in 1905, is that you have these three main parties evolving. The Union of Liberation wants slow conservative change. What they're pushing the Tsar for is we need some type of parliament or constitutional assembly that can advocate legislative changes to the Russian system. So they want kind of a constitutional monarchy, but the problem is the Tsar doesn't want to give up all that power. He trusts some of these characters, but the problem is you have to give up power, and the Tsars don't like to give up power. These guys are kind of acceptable, but the problem is you have to relinquish some legislative control, which they don't want to do. The second party, right, the Social Democratic Party, led by Plankov, who's this character here, is going to argue for a much more radical change. And this is where the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks come into play. This is about, they're following Marxist ideology and the idea that if Russia is industrializing, what you need to do is have a proletariat revolution. The workers need to rise up, seize the means of control, and readjust the government through violent means to a system that doesn't exploit the workers. Now, if you're the Tsar, you didn't like the cadet party too much. Do you like what these guys are advocating, the Social Democrats? No, why not? Yeah, these guys are loco, right? I mean, they're really radical. And within the Social Democratic Party, you have a split between the Bolsheviks who believe you don't have to wait for the Marxist system to develop. You can actually kind of accelerate and charge it with this vanguard of the elite. So you have this revolutionary professional class that can lead the masses to the promised land. And then once everybody realizes how awesome it is, the state will melt away and we'll all work for the good of one another, right? Because workers are incapable of oppressing each other. Great theory, but it doesn't quite work out that way. The Mensheviks, on the other hand, are much more orthodox. They believe you kind of have to allow the system to develop. You have to follow the Marxist paradigm as it evolves. You can't accelerate it. You can't twist it and contort it. So there's always constant tension within the Social Democrats between the leader of the party, who kind of is a middle line between radical acceleration and no, you got to let it evolve. Okay? The last group here, led by Chernov, is the Social Revolutionary Party. These guys want all-out agricultural reform. What they want is a significant land redistribution. They want the peasants to now control the large tracts of land throughout Russia, and they want more power for the people. They're borderline anarchists, by the way. So if you're the Tsar, what are you thinking as these parties start to evolve? Your thoughts about the constitutional Democrats is, okay, I might have to give up a little bit of power, but I can probably suppress the legislative control. What are your thoughts about the Social Democratic Party? Do you want them to have any power at all? No way, they're a threat to order, so exile these guys. So both Plankov, Lenin, and Markov spend lots of time being exiled between, say, 1890 and 1905 because they are a significant threat to public stability in the regime. The social revolutionaries get even more trouble because they're advocating violent overthrow. In fact, Tsar Nicholas is going to equate these characters to the same people's will that assassinated his grandfather. So he wants to keep a hard line on them and tries to suppress them as much as he can. So I hope you're getting a sense for kind of how these things are evolving and the tension within the Russian system as we are approaching 1905, which is really the first revolution. So you're going to have a revolution in 1905 with some minor reforms conducted by Tsar Nicholas, and ultimately it's going to move forward to 1917. All right, let's start with 1905. Let's get to the, so we have the political parties emerging. We have the Zemstvo Congress in 1904, which is an increased call for more and more power to the people for civil liberties. This system has changed since his father's death, and more political-minded cadets and social democrats have emerged as leaders of the Zemstvos. These will become the Soviets, I'll argue. You agree with that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So there's a shifting happening that Nicholas isn't really in tune with, by the way. And there's significant pressure as the middle class unions grow that the Tsar is going to have to concede some power to at least allow for some type of assembly to make legislative adjustments within the system. This is where our good friend Father Gapon comes into play, who is, by all accounts, he's either a deep plant by the Cheka, right, or the Tsar's secret police, and he's informing on the social revolutionaries and the social democrats, or he's a legitimate-minded reform candidate who wants to slowly encourage the Tsar to change the oppressive system of the regime. I don't know what to believe because there's good sources on each side, and having studied the Russian system, I'd probably venture to guess he probably was a plant, at least giving information back to the Tsar and the secret police to keep checks on the radical nature of the social democrats in the regime. So what happens on January 22nd, 1905 is Gapon is leading a mass of police union, right? And you tend not to think of police as radicals, but these are policemen that have been dismissed for various reasons, and they're going to march on the Winter Palace and ask the Tsar in a benevolent letter, please, sir, will you help us adjust the system? We recognize your power, but you have to make some adjustments, which is a much different way from the way the Soviets recount the system or others have recounted, and the fact that they're not storming the Winter Palace. It starts out as a peaceful march to the Winter Palace, which the Tsar isn't even there, by the way. Bad intelligence. But on the way to the march, there's also a social revolutionary march happening with more radical workers. These more radical workers see what Gapon's doing, and they join in the foray, and they make it a much more tense environment. They may pick up a few snowballs, throw them at the guards, throw them at the secret police, and the system quickly spirals out of control because as the mob swells with social revolutionaries who are joining them, it's hard to tell the good protesters from the bad protesters. The secret police believe there's a threat to the Winter Palace, so they open fire on the crowd and kill numerous people. Oh, they also machine gun the mobs down too, by the way, which is a fine Soviet tradition, right? So, if you're advocating social political change, obviously it's by 1905, at least January 1905, this is known as Bloody Sunday, is the Tsar open for discussion on adjusting the political nature of the regime? If you're Father Gapon. No way, right? So what do? And what's unique is that Nicholas is bombarded with all kinds of recommendations that he has to do something because the pressure now is getting to be too much. So that happens in January 1905. There's lots of discussion happening through the spring of 1905. Nicholas is going to call for a consultative assembly, which is his kind of halfway step. He wants to demonstrate that he understands the pressure and he can make some adjustments. But the problem is, in his consultative assembly, he's going to make the argument, I'll allow you guys to be elected, but the reality is you have no power. You can only make recommendations to me. And he sees it as a good halfway step, but the problem is, if you're part of the cadet party, you want some legislative power. If you're a social democrat, you want lots of power. If you're a social revolutionary, you want all the power. So is this going to appease you? Now, if you're an industrial owner, if you're a landed aristocracy member, if you're a member of the court, this is okay because you can maybe get on the consultative committee and kind of advise the Tsar. But beyond that, there's really no power for the people.
What effect did the Japanese victory have on all this?
It puts more pressure on the system because the economic collapse in the Soviet Union, as they're starting to industrialize, the Russo-Japanese War is going to suppress that and make it hard, give the workers a much harder time. The Tsar isn't really doing anything to alleviate the famines that fall on the back end of that and the economic tension falling on the back end of that. Okay? All right, let's talk 1905, June 1905, Battleship of Potemkin. How many of you have seen the movie, right? The great Soviet-era movie. I would argue that Battleship Potemkin essentially demonstrates the tension in the system through one small event, right? Where sailors on the Potemkin, which is one of the cruisers of the Russian fleet, the sailors believe the meat's tainted, right? It has worms. And they appeal to the captain to assess the condition of the meat. The captain appeals to the ship's doctor to examine the meat to see if it's okay. Anybody want to guess what the doctor says about the meat? Fit for consumption, no problem. Eat it. Not happy with that remark, the sailors appeal to the executive officer on the ship for one more look at the meat. The executive officer makes his decision, which is essentially, doctor said the meat's fine. I think the meat's fine. You should eat it. Whereupon the representative of the sailors tries to reason with the XO of the ship, and the XO pulls out a pistol and shoots him. It's mutiny, right? You can have mutiny on the high seas. Once that happens, the sailors on board seize the XO, throw him overboard, seize the captain, throw him overboard, get the doctor, shoot him and throw him overboard, and they shoot the XO and the captain when they're in the water, and they seize control of the Potemkin. They set up a People's Sailors Assembly and proclaim the red flag of revolution, and the ship is now part of the people. And they sail to Odessa and try to help spur a revolution in Odessa, which is quickly suppressed by the Tsar and some cavalry units, of which the sailors on the Potemkin leave to go to Romania. The Romanians say, hey, we'll let you come into port and get coal and food, but you have to surrender the ship. The sailors say, get bent. They go out and they realize, oh, yeah, we're almost out of coal and we're hungry. So they end up going back to Romania and kind of relinquishing the ship, and it ends. But it demonstrates that the Tsar is all about heavy-handed tactics, and that there are revolutionary tensions, but they can be quickly suppressed. Now, as a result of what happens throughout, I would argue, the summer of 1905, is the Tsar finally realizes that he has to do something to alleviate this tension. And it happens in October of 1905 with the October Manifesto. And he's finally going to give the people what they want, a Duma with real legislative functions. But the problem is, although it seems to have real legislative functions, it is still that consultative assembly. It still only has recommendation power to the Tsar. So they can vote on stuff, they can act like they're doing things, but the ultimate power still resides on the Tsar to say yes or no. So it really is an institution that is duly elected by the people, but as far as power to change the system of of the Russian system, it has minimal power. The other reality is that the social revolutionaries and the social democrats want more power. Okay, so in October 1905, Russia now has a Duma, right? And it has some pretty strict ideas on its power, but it also has relatively wide open on who can be elected to it. The social revolutionaries and social democrats are large parts of the first Duma, which we'll talk about in a second here. But the problem is they want more and more power, and they want more power to influence the Russian system. So the first Duma is called May 10th, 1906. It's dissolved within a month because it can't come to any decisions. And it's controlled largely by social revolutionaries and social democrats. And, oh, by the way, the Tsar can dissolve the Duma at any time he wants. So although they have power, they have really no real power, okay? So they try again a year later with the second Duma, and it lasts, I think, 6 weeks, so it lasts marginally longer, but again, it gets out of control because there's too many radicals from the left, and the Tsar dissolves the Duma as well. So if you're a social revolutionary or a Bolshevik or a Menshevik now, you've had two attempts for democracy, right, and more control of the system. But each time you think you're getting somewhere, the Tsar stomps on you again and says, no, we can't do that. And part of the Tsar's assessment is that why these failed is because there are too many radicals in the Duma. So when he calls the third Duma, which is in 1908, he's adjusted the way people can be elected. So essentially, he skews the system so that more cadets and conservatives can get elected to the Duma so you can get business done and you alienate the radicals, meaning the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, and the social revolutionaries. So the third and fourth Dumas actually serve full terms. So the third Duma serves full terms. It's relatively quiet and stable. The fourth Duma assumes its full term and will serve up till March of 1917, and things seem to be going pretty well. I will transition now to Gates.
All right, thank you. Well, in a relative term, I guess. There are three questions that we're going to have to try to answer about what happens in 1917. Why does 1917 end in a change in government when there were clearly issues in 1905 that did not cause the Tsar to abdicate or did not result in the destruction of the Russian system? Secondly, why is the provisional government so weak? And then thirdly, why do the Bolsheviks succeed in October? And hopefully this will allow us to talk about some of the myths that we have, that 1917 is somehow inevitable, that the Tsar has to fall in 1917, and also that it's inevitable that the Bolsheviks will come to power once the Tsar leaves. As Dr. Kalic already said, there's good things going on in 1917, but there's a whole lot of bad things going on in 1917. You can't pretend the war is not going poorly in 1917. You really can't pretend the war is not going poorly in 1915. But by this time, the Tsar is at the head of the field army, which sounds good in theory that the crowned head is now leading his forces. It's certainly romantic. The problem is you don't have a general in between the government and the military policy that you can blame these problems on. So all of the military problems are going to be the Tsar's problems, and you really don't want to talk about firing the Tsar, especially if you're Nicholas II. The other issue that you have is this really shows the problems that Russia faces in terms of waging industrial warfare. Dr. Kalic talked about how throughout this modernization and industrialization, there are stresses within the economic system in Russia, and World War I is going to bring those to a head. The winter of 1916 and 1917 is incredibly brutal, and it makes supplying the capital difficult. They probably have enough food, it's really fuel. And so by the beginning of 1917, you're running out of fuel to fire the ovens, and you're running out of fuel to run the factories. And that's going to be the catalyst for these demonstrations that are going to end in abdication. Even though the winter is terrible, there's a break. In February, it actually gets up into the 40s, which sounds wonderful, except there are demonstrations protesting the lack of food. There was a rumor that the government was going to start rationing bread purchases, and it causes a run on bread. And so soon, people can't buy bread. And they start to protest this. And then the workers are joining the protest because they're furloughed because their factories can't work for lack of fuel. These protests are going on as Nicholas leaves the capital, and his ministers say, "It's okay, we think we've got this. These are just run-of-the-mill protests that you have in Russia." They're going to spiral out of control. And when they get to over 100,000, Nicholas asks his ministers to do what they claim they told him they could do, and that is suppress the protest. And so you look to the army to do that. The problem is the army you have in 1917 is not the army that you have in 1905, because the long service professionals that are dedicated and loyal to the state are either dead, they're injured, or they're at the front. The folks in the capital, there's about 160,000 troops in the capital, but many of those are new conscripts. So when they look at the protesters, they were civilians only weeks ago, and now they're in a different uniform, but they identify much more with the protesters than they do with the state. Or they're reservists who have been reactivated. They feel like they've already done their bit for king and country, and now they're being asked again to serve. Well, again, they identify much more with the protesters than they do with the state. Now, the first instance of violence to put down these protests seems to work. But what's going on behind the scenes is inside of the barracks, the soldiers are coming to terms with what has happened. And quickly, many of them make two decisions that are going to be catastrophic for the regime. About half of them, so around 80,000, are going to decide that they're going to be neutral. They won't take part in suppressing the protest, but they're also not going to take part in the protest. They'll just remove themselves. The army should be apolitical anyway. And that's bad. It's never a good thing for soldiers to disobey orders, but it's not as bad as what the other about 80,000 are going to do. They are going to vote to join the protest. And so now you've got over 150,000 folks protesting in the Capitol. The police can't handle this. That's why they had to go to the army in the first place. And now the forces that were supposed to provide order for the regime have either abdicated that responsibility or have, in fact, joined the protest. So, in fact, there is a revolution, even though Nicholas hasn't really admitted the fact. He's lost the ability to control his capital. Once he understands the gravity of the situation, he makes plans to go back and provide security. He's going to get a loyal general from the front, he's going to get some loyal troops from the front, and he's going to send them back to suppress this insurrection. He wants to have a couple of days in between the troops coming to provide security and the Tsar entering the city, so that way the Tsar can enter a calm capital, not a capital that is restive. That is going to be catastrophic for Nicholas, because in that interim, what's going to happen is the Duma, which Nicholas dissolves very early on in the protest, although they continue to meet. The Duma is going to be talking to senior leaders in the Russian army, and they're going to convince these generals that if only the Tsar would leave, if we can get a sympathetic monarch, like Nicholas's son, we can have a narrative around that monarch. And even though it'll be a regency, we feel like we can have some stability, but Nicholas can no longer serve. And so Nicholas talks with his generals about how best to proceed, and they let him know that it is time for you to lay down the crown for the good of Russia and for the good of the war effort. And I would argue that's the difference in 1917 and 1905. Nicholas is resolved to maintain power in 1905. 1917, he makes a decision to abdicate. And when he makes that decision, only about 130, 140 people are dead in the capital as a result of these protests. Maybe 500 are wounded. It's not bloody. It is the fact that the Tsar abdicates power. So once you've got the Tsar gone, why do you struggle with the provisional government? Well, the first issue is he abdicates for his son. But when he's told that his son can't live with the family, that is a setback, because the Tsarevich is ill with hemophilia, and Nicholas is convinced that if he doesn't live with the family, then he will die an early death, which is probably true. And so he takes it upon himself to abdicate for his son as well. And then the crown is supposed to go to his brother. His brother's not fit, but his brother also is adept at understanding the political winds, and when approached with this opportunity, he says, no, I'm not going to take the crown unless there's a constituent assembly that votes a constitutional monarchy and wants me to serve. And so we talked about those tensions about getting some agency for the people. It seems like you've got a Romanov who wants agency for the people. He's never going to get a chance to see if the constituent assembly is going to offer him the crown or not. So the people who jump into the breach are the Duma leaders. And the problem with the Duma leaders is Nicholas dissolved the Duma. So any legislative mandate that they had is already expired once the Tsar dissolves the body. And as Dr. Kalic pointed out, even if you want to agree that they can continue to have some mandate, it wasn't really a leading mandate. They weren't elected to make decisions, they were elected more to consult. But they take it upon themselves to form the government. And they have a different theory about how best to create a democratic Russia. And it's going to be let organic solutions come from the cities, from Russia. The Tsar had been too top-down. And so they dissolved the secret police, they dissolved provincial governments, they dissolved the central government. And all of this sounds good to people who want radical change. But imagine if the central government in Washington, D.C. abdicated its responsibility and then dissolved all of the state governments as well. And then now it was just up to local governments to try to figure out how do you rule a country. And you understand that this really is going to look much more like anarchy than it's going to look like an organic opportunity for democracy to come from the ground up. And so the provisional government is going to struggle through 1917 to try to get its footing. It understands that it needs to have an election to create a constituent assembly, but there's always going to be another problem before you can get to those elections, because you're still fighting a war. One of the ideas about the impact of World War I in 1917 is that this is an anti-war movement. However, that's not really true, because when we look at the spread of war policies, there's really only one party that's going to advocate for a quick cessation of the war, and that's going to be the Bolsheviks. Many of the other parties want victory. They want to fight on. They just want this to be a well-run war. And so the provisional government is going to continue that as much as possible. By the middle of the year, July 1917, Alexander Kerensky, who kind of has a foot in both ponds. He is a member of the Petrograd Soviet, which Dr. Kalic talked about, these Zemstvos. The Soviets is much more organized around workers in the capital, and it's a way for them to speak with one voice about these revolutionary issues that are really consuming conversation in the capital. So Alexander Kerensky is a member of that body. He's also a member of the Provisional Government. And the Provisional Government, in order to provide some legitimacy, reached out to the Petrograd Soviet and asked the Soviet, in essence, for its blessing. And the Executive Committee of the Soviet, which is appointed from all of the socialist parties inside the Soviet, so it's not really elected to the leadership of the Soviet as much as you are appointed. But they say, we will support the government as long as the government passes regulations that we support. So we'll bless off on what we agree with, and if we don't agree with it, we will not provide any blessing for it. And this is clear from the first order that the Petrograd Soviet publishes, which states, among other things, that every military unit has to create its own Soviet. So from the company level up to the regimental level, which you can think about that in our terms from a company up to about a brigade, is going to have their own elected group of enlisted people to represent that unit. And then these military Soviets will take over control of the weapons of that military formation. And further, any order from the government has to be countersigned by the Petrograd Soviet in order for it to be valid, which is striking, When you think about the role of a government should be to have a monopoly on the use of force, and yet from the birth of the Provisional Government, you have the Petrograd Soviet also providing that blessing in order to use force. And so there's this diarchy inside of revolutionary Russia, and that's one of the reasons why the Provisional Government's never able to gain a solid footing. Kerensky is going to come to lead the Provisional Government after the July offensive. He pushes for this offensive as a way to rally the country around the government. If you have a successful war effort, the people will see that the government is doing its job, and then they will back it. It goes well for a couple of days, but again, it gets back to the problem that Russia has with industrial warfare. They can't sustain the momentum. So once the Germans shift forces down to help the Austrians, the Russian soldiers flee, and the government almost collapses, but Kerensky's there to save the day for the Provisional Government. The Bolsheviks are also exploiting some of these opportunities as a way to try to seize power, and we'll talk about how the Bolsheviks have a different understanding than some of the other political parties. But Kerensky is going to maintain leadership until October. What occupies Kerensky's thoughts, much more than a Bolshevik coup, is a counter-revolution from the right. He is always suspicious of the military. And what he is looking at is the French Revolution. That's always in his mind. And in there you see a counter-revolution. You have a revolution that overthrows the monarchy, and then Napoleon comes in and saves the revolution from itself. Well, Kerensky doesn't want the revolution to be saved by the army. And that is what is going to ultimately bring about his downfall. In August, Kerensky orders General Kornilov, who is the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, to move a cavalry corps into the capital to provide protection. We don't have time to go into the whole Kornilov affair, but what happens is this troop movement, Kerensky then believes is evidence of a coup. From Kornilov's point of view, the leader of the government asked for these troop movements. We were in line with these orders, but Kerensky is going to look at this as evidence that the military is launching a counter-revolution. And he's going to fire Kornilov and accuse him of treason. The problem is he can't find anybody else to take his place. And so you have this weird situation in August of 1917 where the commander-in-chief of the Russian army is accused by the government of treason, and yet he maintains his command. You can imagine what this does for soldier morale. Soldiers are frustrated by the political process, and so they are going to just remove themselves from it. You know, until the government figures out who's going to lead, we're just going to fight the war. We're not going to worry about what's going on in the rear. And that's going to prove fatal to Kerensky and the Provisional Government. Because one of the reasons why 1917 ends the way that it does is because of Lenin. Dr. Kalic talked about Lenin being a member of the Bolshevik Party, and they had a different understanding of this evolution to socialism. And there's a conversation in the Petrograd Soviet, and they're really disappointed because nobody in the Soviet wants to lead. They all want to criticize. They want to be part of the opposition. No party wants to take it upon themselves to actually lead Russia. And Lenin stops the speaker and he says, but there is one. And that's what separates the Bolsheviks from the other socialist parties, is the Bolsheviks and Lenin want to lead. Lenin is a little out of step with members of his party. They want this to be more of an election. They're going to have one. They want to create a constituent assembly. Certainly the Bolsheviks can be popular enough to win that, and then once we're elected, that's how we can best rise to power. But Lenin understands that in order to win elections, you have to have broad popular support. The Bolsheviks don't have broad popular support. And so Lenin advocates for these putsches in April. They want to organize some street demonstrations and then use those to set conditions similar to what happened in February. It doesn't quite work out. Same thing in July. As a result of the failed offensive, they want to launch demonstrations and use that as a way to seize power. That doesn't work out. And so by the time you get to the fall of 1917, Lenin's changed. He's realized that these demonstrations don't offer the right forum. We're just going to have to take power. But he doesn't really have a good tool for doing that because you don't want to be too overt. You don't want it to be obvious the Bolsheviks are taking power. You have to work within the system as it exists. And that's where the role of contingency is going to offer some opportunities. As the war effort continues to devolve in 1917, the Germans are going to take Riga, which opens a path to invade, to capture, possibly, St. Petersburg. And there's rumors in the capital that the government is going to abandon the capital in order to let the Germans take it. And what this would do is allow the Germans to stamp out the revolution. They'd take Red Petersburg. The problem is, if anybody knew who was supporting the Bolsheviks, they would understand that the Germans were the least likely folks to actually suppress the Bolsheviks, because the Germans are the one that pay for Lenin to get from Switzerland into Finland and into Russia, and they're continuing to support the Bolshevik press throughout 1917. But within the Petrograd Soviet, this inspires the Mensheviks to offer a proposal. If the government's not going to defend the capital, the government's not going to defend the revolution, then certainly the revolution should defend itself. And so they propose a military revolution committee as a way to provide some protection. Initially, the Bolsheviks push back against this, but then when it comes to the floor of the Petrograd Soviet, the Bolsheviks realize that they've done a pretty good job agitating amongst the soldiers, and they already have a military organization. So if the Soviets going to have to build a military organization, they'd probably need some foundation to exploit. And then the Bolsheviks support this proposal because they understand if they control the Military Revolution Committee, then now they have a tool with which to seize power in the name of the Soviet, but actually in the name of the Bolsheviks. And so this creation of a Military Revolution Committee is this venue. But you still have a debate about how do you bless this coup? Because if the Bolsheviks are too open about why they're doing this, then they might encourage some backlash. Trotsky wants to have a Soviet Congress. The problem is, again, even within the Soviet, the Bolsheviks really don't have a broad mandate. They're not the most popular party inside of the Soviet, both in Petersburg and in Russia. So what they do is they create a rump Soviet Congress. They invite Soviets to send delegates from where they have their support, kind of in the northern and eastern part of Russia. The Petrograd Soviet does not approve of this gathering. They call it a private meeting, but it really doesn't matter. So they plan to have this convene on October 20th. They need to get the ball rolling because in September, Kerensky says we're going to finally have those elections, and the Provisional Government is going to give up power 28 November. So elections will be 12 November, 28 November, we're going to give up power. Russia will finally have an elected body to lead it. This puts a line in the sand for the Bolsheviks. If you're going to seize power, it has to be before these elections, because then you have to change the electoral mandate. If you control the government before the election, well, you can always manipulate elections so they come out the way that you want them to. And so this deadline really spurs them to action. On 21 October, you've got the delegates from these Bolshevik-friendly Soviets coming into the capital, and the Military Revolution Committee, which is controlled by the Bolsheviks, approaches the army staff in the capital and lets the army staff know that the Bolsheviks, the Military Revolution Committee, now have executive authority over the Petrograd garrison, which is phenomenal. If you think about this, what's actually happening is a political body is going into something akin to the Pentagon and telling the army staff, it's okay, you think you own the army, but you don't, we do. And of course the army staff says, no, we understand that there might be not a clear chain of command, but once it gets past the government level and we're talking about executing orders, we should have some control over that. We don't have to give that authority up. This allows the Military Revolution Committee to indict the army staff as a counter-revolutionary tool. And this also gives them the ability to indict the Provisional Government as a counter-revolutionary element, which is all you need to then launch a coup to protect the revolution, because that's what this is all about. This has nothing to do with Lenin and the Bolsheviks taking power, right? This is all about protecting the revolution. And so on 24 and 25 October, the Bolsheviks are going to seize key terrain inside of the capital. They're going to take the telegraph agency and they're going to take the telegraph office to isolate the government, which is now in the Winter Palace. They do this in large part by walking up to the guards and letting the guards know that their shift is over and that the member of the Military Revolution Committee will assume their guard duty. And the guards say, thank you very much, I'm going to go home and rest. So it's not a revolution in the sense of fighting, It's really much more of a coup that you have this military organization just taking power, but the government, again, is not necessarily fighting back. And so on the 25th of October, you have a new government. The problem is nobody really knows you have a new government because the Bolsheviks don't want to be too overt about this. They call their new government a provisional government. It's a catchy name. And throughout the 25th, they're going to continue to try to consolidate different areas of the government and the capital. That way they can then present this to their second Soviet Congress, which is really a rump Soviet Congress, and have that Congress vote on the legitimacy of this new government. Now, Kerensky is panicked, and he's trying to get in touch with the army because the army is the only force that can save the government. We saw that in 1905. The problem is he's alienated the army, and so he actually goes out and he's talking to soldiers, and they agree, we'll go a little bit, but unless we see more soldiers moving, we're not actually going to go to the capital. And Kerensky finds himself without a home. He's alienated the conservatives because he is a socialist. He's alienated the army after the Kornilov affair, and he's alienated the Bolsheviks because he wants to work within the provisional government. The Bolsheviks want to destroy the government. Now, the rest of the provisional government is still in the Winter Palace, and there are some great Soviet pictures of people storming the Winter Palace. And when we think about the October Revolution, that's what we think of, because if it's a revolution, there must be conflict of some sort. But those are all staged after the fact. What actually happens is you have some of these Military Revolution Committee members go, they're quickly turned back because there are shots fired from the Winter Palace, and they get a cruiser, the Aurora, to fire a salvo, but it doesn't have any live ammunition, it's all blanks. And then they have some artillery in the Peter and Paul Fortress, which is close to the Winter Palace. After some ill-aimed shots, the government realizes nobody's coming to the rescue. Kerensky's not there, the army's not showing up, and we're surrounded. We're going to give up. Now, why don't more people push against the Bolsheviks once it becomes clear what they've done? One of the things that Lenin understands is Russia really doesn't matter, and the interest groups don't really matter. But what that gives him is incredible freedom. And so when the Bolsheviks are approached about ethnic minorities and self-determination for different nationally derived republics, of course you can do that. We want people to create their own representative governments. Of course, the reality will be you can do that as long as they're part of a united Soviet Socialist Republic. For the soldiers, you want peace? Of course we want peace. We want to end this war. This is terrible. But for Lenin, the real war is yet to come, and there will be no negotiated peace with a worldwide revolution. For the workers that want more power, they want ownership of the factory, the Bolsheviks would love that. We want the owners to control the factory. It doesn't matter who controls it when the state controls everything. So for the Bolsheviks, they're willing to make any compromise necessary in order to gain power, because they understand that once they gain power, they'll destroy the institutions of the state, but then create something that looks very similar to the police state that Alexander III creates. And I think that's one of the differences when we're looking at why Lenin comes to power, why the Bolsheviks come to power, and why Nicholas isn't quite the man for the role in 1917, is Nicholas is never really comfortable with ruling. Yes, he's an autocrat. Yes, he takes pride in that, but that's a duty that God forced upon him. It's not something that he wanted. That's not true for Lenin. Lenin is more than willing to wield the full power and authority of the state. In fact, that's what his driving ambition is, and that is what the driving ambition is of the Bolsheviks. And so that's why you have Lenin leading Russia in October 1917, and Nicholas falling very early in 1917. All right, thank you. I think we'll take some questions.
You've described these Bolsheviks as being very keen to take power and very shrewd in acquiring it. But I wondered if the Bolsheviks had any sincere agenda for changing the country apart from just wanting to run it themselves.
Yeah, so in terms of, and Dr. Kalic, fill in too,
Sure.
Lenin has a clear agenda. You need to destroy the state. Because previous revolutionary attempts, previous attempts at altering Russia had all worked within the confines of what existed. Now, there's the ideology of Marxism that seems to provide a roadmap for what could happen. The problem is that's a utopian description. So what do you do in the here and now? And so what they're going to do is demolish a lot of the vestiges of Tsarist Russia, but then they have to kind of ad hoc a lot of things into existence. So Lenin is going to destroy a lot of the government functions, but in terms of the economic changes, he's actually going to leverage some of the capitalist institutions in order to provide revenue and funds for the state, but it's never really a comfortable marriage. Now, Lenin is not going to be as doctrinaire as Stalin is, and I think Lenin's much more open to adaptation to meet reality, where Stalin's going to be much more doctrinaire.
Yeah, I agree. If you look at the Bolsheviks leading up to the revolution, the language they're using and some of the documents we looked at, they're all about democracy. I mean, they're talking women have equal rights, they're talking, massive land reforms, peasants, workers working together. That all goes away pretty quick within a month of the revolution, where the Red Scare comes down. Okay, peasants, you're really not workers, so therefore we have to, you're suspect. Mm-hmm. So I think they have an agenda, but they're opportunists, and they know how to play the system well to get everybody to support the revolution, and when the revolution comes, thanks for your help, we'll take it from here.
Yeah, it's too late then.
And they are obsessive with counter-revolutionaries. I mean, the Red Scare happens, and the Cheka, the secret police, get mobilized like within a month after the revolution. So what we come to know is that the oppressive Soviet state is really there from the inception of the regime.
The Soviet or the Russian Army, where is it as far as the fronts of World War I? And then when the revolution happens, is it moved back to Russia or some other place?
Go ahead.
Okay, so when the revolutions happen, so I would use the term revolution for what happens in February. That's a revolution. The Bolsheviks, a little bit more of a coup maybe, but you still have fielded forces on the front lines around kind of the western borders of Russia, Poland, that area. They're not going to start coming back into the interior until you start to get into the Civil War. And what's going to happen, the Bolsheviks realize you need to end the war quickly. And they're going to do that with a pretty disadvantageous peace. But they do that because they need to start consolidating power, and it's hard to consolidate power when you've got a war effort going on. And so when they initially seize power, the army looks a lot like it did under the Tsar in terms of its dispositions. That's going to change after the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that's when they're able to start pulling folks back, and they're going to have to rebuild the army because the army is a counter-revolutionary suspect force. So they're actually going to have to figure out how do you make a red army. Well, certainly our workers can do that, but
yeah,
the
first army is called like the People's Army, and they abolish rank, and they abolish, if you serve in the Tsarist army, you can't be part of it because it's all about, the good people. But they quickly realize, Trotsky quickly realizes you can't run an army that way. So a lot of the vestiges of the Tsarist army come back in, but they're always suspect of former Tsarists. So they maintain the structure, they just rename it, and they put workers in charge of it. Mm-hmm. And then they're going to fight it for the Civil War, which is intriguing. Any other questions? All right.
Why is the war so unpopular among the population?
I don't know that I would say it's necessarily unpopular. If we're talking about what's going on in Russia at the beginning of 1917, I wouldn't say it's necessarily unpopular. What's unpopular is the war effort's not run well. Right. They want to win. And in fact, when you look at what the Provisional Government's talking about, what the Mensheviks are talking about, what the cadets are talking about, they're all talking about a victory. They want to get some of the things they're promised, maybe control of the straits. It's really the Bolsheviks that are the anti-war party. Right. And I don't think that it's ever unpopular. In fact, when they sign the treaty, a lot of Russians are frustrated with that because they give away a lot of territory. They have to pay indemnities. It's not a good treaty for the Russians. And yes, the war's not going terribly, but they're clearly not as bad as things were compared to the treaty and in light of the treaty.
And I think Kerensky's a fine example of that in the summer when he launches the next offensive, which the Bolsheviks use that as an example of, see, you're squandering precious Russian citizens, but the vast majority of Russians are kind of behind it because they see it as one last attempt to kind of, gain some more advantage. But the Bolsheviks are just better at the PR game.
Yeah. And I think since the Bolsheviks are going to control the government until 1989, there's a lot of revisionists they're able to do to craft the narrative of what does World War I look like from a Russian perspective. And then after the fall, you have more of an opportunity to understand maybe the weakness of that narrative.
Yeah, and the other part of that is, as Gates pointed out, there's some supposition that maybe the Germans will come support, but the reality is that we run into some documents from a German ambassador who's sending messages back to Germany saying, hey, that guy Lenin we paid off, this is paying huge dividends for us. Mm-hmm. We should start giving them more money because, you know what, this is going to work out in our favor perfectly. We don't even have to invade. So it's pretty intriguing to see that they are playing this kind of asymmetric card of, you just foment revolution in the rear and the system's going to collapse on itself. You don't have to fight it. It's a great way to win World War I, by the way.
Just happens too late for the Germans.
Just happens too late for the Germans, yeah. They didn't have Lenin on the other front, by the way, either.
What happened to all of those other leaders that you had going from left to right on one of your earlier slides? What happened to them physically?
Most of them end up dead.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Struve is dead by the time of the revolution. Milyukov ends up as a enemy of the regime, as a counter-revolutionary because he doesn't follow in line with the Bolsheviks. Plenkov survives the initial revolution, but then is seen as a White Guard wrecker and is dismissed. I don't know what happens to Marchov and Chertov. I think becomes part of the system, but then ultimately under Stalin is liquidated. If you're not a Bolshevik, you don't survive.
Well, that's true.
Or at least
even if you are a Bolshevik, you might not survive too.
Yeah, and what's interesting is the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks kind of get together on the eve of the revolution and kind of carry it through the Civil War. But once the Civil War happens, there's significant tension still between those characters that really never goes away. So you're either with Lenin or you're against Lenin.
Speaking of the political leaders and what happens to them, Nicholas II and his family ends up being executed, and I wondered why the Bolsheviks were so eager to do that as opposed to some other disposition.
What happens initially, there's hope that maybe under the Provisional Government, they reach out to Britain, and maybe we can get the Tsar and his family out of Russia. But then the British government pushes against that because it might actually upset the war effort at home in Britain. And then once the Bolsheviks take power, what they realize is the existence of the Tsar's family is a great nexus of counter-revolutionary support. So you got to get rid of the Tsar. Now, the Bolsheviks are going to claim that, well, no, we don't order the execution of the Tsar, that happens as some rogue people making their own decisions. But in fact, what happens is, yes, the Bolshevik Party orders the execution of the Tsar and his family, and it's because there are white forces that are getting close to where the Tsar and his family are exiled, and they think that if the White Army gets the Tsar, then that will give them much more support across Russia as a whole, because now they've got the Tsar, and what do the Bolsheviks have to rally the nation? I think that, again, kind of speaks against the idea. When we think about revolutions, we think about the French Revolution, which is broadly popular because everybody understands some of the problems in the regime. The Bolsheviks don't have that kind of revolution. They are always trying to argue that they have much broader support than they actually do. And so if the White Army coalesces, and capturing the Tsar would be a great way to coalesce the White Army, then maybe they could be a much more formidable body of resistance against the Reds. That doesn't happen.
They're all, up through the revolution, they're a minority party, but they talk like they're a majority party. and they're able to convince people they're a majority party. And having a czar around after the fact is always going to be a potential for a rally point for counter-revolutionaries, so you just can't physically have it around.
Yeah, Tom, this is an area of new scholarship that's out on Britain's, the plan to save the Romanovs, and it's not Britain's finest hour.
No,
It really is. They
Right.
kind of throw the Romanovs to the dogs.
for a long time, the assumption was the prime minister was the one who argued against it. But in fact, the recent scholarship showed that actually it comes from the king, that I'm not sure this is the
Right.
best thing to do. And that was, for a while, that was the narrative the royal family had. Well, we would have, but the politicians said it couldn't happen, and now we see that it was actually a little bit more complicated. Yes.
Yes, yeah.
The White Russians last for a long while, or quite a while, all the way up through past 1919, especially out in Asia,
Yeah.
the piece, the
222,
Americans that are
yeah.
there, and the Siberian expedition, which the vast majority of the forces are Japanese. So
Yeah.
when's the end date for the White Russians?
Well, I guess when the last one dies, right? I mean, there's still White Russians around, I think, on the eve of the Second World War that are still advocating, this is our chance now.
But as a force, for 22, 24,
Yeah, I'd say
something on
22 at the end of the Civil War is when the Bolsheviks can claim at least solidification.
Yeah.
And they're not, I mean, they're always going to be paranoid about it, but as far as a real threat, maybe once Trotsky ends up with an ice pick in his head, that may be the real death of it too, though. Or at least a counter-revolutionary within the counter-revolution. So, but the whites, I think 22 is probably a good date. Yes. Sorry.
When the royal family is eliminated, how much wind out of the sails is taken out on the White Army, or does it affect?
I think it affects it, but I mean, the White Army, if you follow the Civil War, there's some significant offenses by the Civil War, and by the Cossacks too, by the way, who were the traditional guards of the Tsars. It loses a rallying point, but I think the whites are dedicated to the old system, so whether the Tsar is there or not, it's still going to empower them, but the reality is your touchstone to reestablishing the old regime's gone.
And the other problem, so when you talk about the White Army, it implies a level of uniformity and
Right.
cohesion that's just not there. You have groups that can all agree we should have something that looks like the old Russia, but they don't agree who should lead, they don't agree what formations they're part of, and so you've got, in aggregate, probably there are more White Army forces than there are Red Army forces, but they are not cohesive or coordinated. And that's one of the issues that if they get the Tsar, will that
Right.
provide a way to actually provide cohesion to that unit or to that formation that can all agree we want to fight the Red Army? It doesn't happen, and they never solidify as a group to actually fight. And sometimes they're fighting amongst themselves,
Right.
and the Red Army is kind of a distraction. So it's fascinating.
In researching Red Army, White Army, Green Armies,
Yeah,
and we
there's
found
a
few
Black
other-
Army.
Yeah, Black Army. That none of them really solidified. We tend to think of Army as these unified kind of command structures. Not really. They're kind of rogue bands. Okay, you're an ally with us today, all right. And the Greens are kind of like Cossacks, and the Blacks are some like anarchists and Cossacks, and it's a unique kind of jello-like blend of forces. So the Whites, there are pockets of Whites, but they don't always get along depending on where they are and what they want to achieve. So there's just no unified objective.
The ones that are unified are the Bolsheviks.
Correct.
That is the continuous
That is the
strain,
only-
and
right.
that's the problem. Is they're always generally the minority, but they have a cohesive understanding of how they're going to fight this, and their adversaries rarely do.
They're just better organized than their adversaries.
That's
all.
true.
Better party discipline.
What was Lenin's background?
He's a professional revolutionary.
His family, it's interesting, his dad is a school inspector
Correct.
and actually achieves pretty high rank in the Russian civil service. He actually gains a hereditary nobility. And Lenin's brother does get executed for
attempting to
his
assassinate the Tsar.
for his revolutionary activities, but at that time, it's not clear that Lenin's radicalized by that.
Right.
When he goes to law school, that's when he falls off the beaten path.
He seems to become radicalized in that 1880 time frame. After his brother has been murdered, he seems to be more sympathetic to the cause.
Yep.
Starts writing a lot.
But he's not, he is a full-time revolutionary. That's another difference with the Bolsheviks.
He's a professional revolutionary.
To be a Bolshevik, a member of the Bolshevik Party, you have to be a full-time revolutionary. A lot of these other parties that Dr. Kalic talked about, you could be a member of the party, but you got your day job. For the Bolsheviks, you are an agitator. You
Yeah,
are...
like Struve's an economist. I mean, and you have some ministers here, but his job is to write and agitate. His job is to write and agitate. I guess if you're dedicated to the cause, that's your only mission and objective. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? I guess we left them stunned.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice job.